I walked out of my brother's rehearsal dinner on a Tuesday night in October and I didn't look back once. Not at the restaurant. Not at the table full of relatives who watched me go. Not at my mother, who called my name twice before her voice dropped into that low, controlled register I'd known my whole life. The one that meant, "You will pay for this later." I just kept walking. Through the lobby. Past the hostess stand. Out into the cold air that smelled like rain and exhaust and something that felt, for the first time in years, like relief. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the thing about stories like mine. You want to start at the end because the end is the only part that finally makes sense. My name is Vivienne. I'm 31 now. I grew up in a house in Columbus, Ohio, where the rules were never written down, but everyone knew them. My father worked in logistics. My mother kept the house and kept the peace, which really meant she kept everyone in line. I have one brother, older by 4 years. His name is Curtis. From the time I was old enough to carry a laundry basket, I understood my role. I cooked breakfast before school. I set the table. I cleared the table. I did the dishes while Curtis sat in the living room watching television. I folded his clothes on Saturdays. I ironed his shirts when he started high school and suddenly cared about looking good. I cleaned the bathroom we shared, even though the mess was mostly his. I remade his bed when my mother inspected the rooms because Curtis could never get the corners right, and somehow that became my problem. Nobody assigned these tasks in a formal way. There was no list on the refrigerator that said Vivienne's chores on one side and Curtis's chores on the other. It was more like gravity. It was just the way things were arranged, and gravity doesn't explain itself. When I was 12, I asked my mother why I had to do Curtis's laundry. She was folding dish towels at the kitchen counter. She didn't look up. "Because he's busy," she said. "I'm busy too," I said. She set down the dish towel. She looked at me for a long moment. "Vivienne," she said, "a woman who takes care of her home is a woman who keeps her family together. That's not a punishment, that's a gift." I didn't say anything else. I'd already learned that the conversation ended when she decided it ended. Curtis was not a bad person in the way that villains are bad in movies. He didn't twist his hands together or laugh at my expense. He was just comfortable. He accepted everything that was done for him the way you accept oxygen, without thinking about it, without gratitude, because the alternative had never occurred to him. He'd leave his dishes in the sink, leave his wet towels on the bathroom floor, come home from hanging out with his friends and drop his jacket on the chair by the door, and the next morning it would be hung up. Not by him. My mother would say things to him like, "Your sister works so hard, doesn't she?" And Curtis would smile and say, "Yeah, she's great," and go back to whatever he was doing. That was the whole transaction. I was great. And the work continued. When I got to college, Ohio State, partial scholarship, I worked 20 hours a week in the campus library to cover what the scholarship didn't. I started to realize that not everyone had grown up this way. My roommate freshman year, a girl from Michigan named Abby, could not boil water. Her brother couldn't either. They'd both grown up in a house where the chores were split evenly and nobody questioned it. She thought my childhood sounded like something from another era. Like he literally never did his own laundry, she said once. We were sitting in the common room. I'd just gotten off the phone with my mother who'd asked when I was coming home for the weekend to help clean the gutters. "Not once," I said. Abby stared at me. "Vivienne, that's not normal." I knew it wasn't. But knowing something and being able to do anything about it are two very different things when you're still financially dependent on the people who built the system. So I graduated, got a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Columbus, close enough to home that my mother expected Sunday dinners, but far enough that I had my own apartment, my own routines, my own life slowly taking shape. I visited on holidays. I helped when I was asked. I told myself that distance was the same thing as freedom. It wasn't, but it was close enough for a while. Curtis met his fiancée. Her name is Tamsin. 2 years ago at a work conference in Cincinnati. She's an accountant. She's pleasant, a little quiet, and she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't that funny, which, based on my experience with my mother, seemed like a skill she would need. The engagement was announced at Christmas. My parents were thrilled. My mother cried. My father shook Curtis's hand and then hugged him for a long time. I said congratulations and meant it, mostly. The wedding was planned for the following November. And for a while that's all it was. A wedding being planned, something happening in the background of my regular life. Then my mother called me in March. I wanted to run something by you, she said. Which is the way my mother begins sentences that are not actually questions. She explained that Curtis and Thompson had found an apartment in Dublin, a suburb of Columbus, about 20 minutes from my parents' house. It was a nice place, she said. 2 bedrooms. A good neighborhood. Okay, I said. Well, she said, you know Thompson works long hours. Her firm is very demanding. And Curtis, you know how he is with the household things. I did know. We were thinking, my mother said, that it would make sense for you to be nearby, to help them get settled. Maybe a few nights a week at first, just until they find their footing. I was sitting at my kitchen table when she said this. I remember looking at the window, at the rain streaking down the glass, and feeling something go very still inside me. You want me to help Curtis run his household, I said. I want you to help your brother and his new wife, my mother said. That's what family does. Mom, I said. I have a job. I have my own apartment. Your apartment is 30 minutes away. It's not a burden, Vivienne. It's not about the distance. I'm not asking you to move in, she said with a small laugh, as though I was being dramatic. Just to be present, to help, the way you always have. The way you always have. She said it like it was a compliment. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't sleep that night. The rehearsal dinner was at a steakhouse in Worthington. 72 people, rehearsed toasts, round tables with white cloth, the kind of evening that looks perfect in photographs. I almost didn't go. I'd spent the 6 months between that phone call and that October night trying to figure out what I was going to do. Not just about the wedding or the apartment, but about everything. About the fact that I was 30 years old and my family had never stopped seeing me as a function rather than a person. About the fact that I kept showing up, kept helping, kept swallowing things down because I didn't know how to stop without blowing something up. My therapist. I'd started seeing her in June, a woman named Dr. Park who had a plant on her windowsill and the most patient voice I've ever heard. Said that what I was describing was a family system built on invisible labor and gendered expectation, and that I was allowed to opt out of it. That opting out didn't make me a bad daughter or a bad sister. That wanting to be seen as a full person was not the same as abandoning my family. I knew all of this intellectually. The knowing hadn't made it easier yet. So I went to the rehearsal dinner. I put on a dress and did my hair, and drove to Worthington and smiled and hugged people I hadn't seen in years, and it was fine. It was mostly fine. Until after dinner, when the speeches were winding down and people were ordering dessert. And my father stood up. He didn't have a microphone. He just stood and tapped his fork on his glass and waited for the room to settle, the way he'd always commanded attention without asking for it. I want to say a few words, he said, about this family we're building. It was a nice speech. He talked about Curtis, about how proud he was, about what a good man his son had become. He talked about Thompson, about welcoming her into the family. He talked about what marriage means. Partnership, commitment, showing up for each other. And then he looked at me. We're lucky, he said, to have Vivienne. She's always taken care of this family. And I know she'll be there for Curtis and Thompson the same way she's always been there for all of us. He raised his glass. To Vivienne. The room raised their glasses. 72 people, smiling, toasting me. I sat completely still. My aunt leaned over and squeezed my hand. That's so sweet, she whispered. I thought he just announced it, in front of everyone. He announced that I would be their housekeeper, and he framed it as a compliment, and everyone applauded. My face was doing the right things. I could feel it, the practiced expression of gracious acknowledgement. But something had shifted underneath it. Some wire had finally quietly snapped. After the toasts during the dessert course, my mother appeared at my elbow. That was lovely, wasn't it? She said. What your father said. Sure, I said. I meant to tell you, Curtis and Thompson are planning to move in the second week of December. It would be great if you could be there that first weekend to help them get organized. You know how Curtis is with the kitchen. I set down my fork. Mom, I said, I'm not going to do that. She tilted her head the way she does when she mishears something. I'm not going to be their housekeeper, I said. I'm not going to come over a few nights a week and cook and clean and organize Curtis's life for him. I'm not doing that. The table around us had gone slightly quiet. Not the whole room, just the 4 or 5 people closest to us who had caught the shift in register. Vivienne, my mother said, low and controlled, this is not the time. I know, I said. But I've been waiting for the right time for 20 years and it never seems to come. She stared at me. He's an adult, I said. He's a 35-year-old man who is about to be married. He knows how to do his own laundry. He's capable of learning to cook. Tamsin is not my responsibility. His household is not my responsibility. No one said. Dad just toasted me for it, I said. In front of 72 people. Silence. My mother's expression did not crack. It hardened. There's a difference. I don't know what has gotten into you, she said. But this is your brother's rehearsal dinner, and if you cannot behave like a member of this family... I love Curtis, I said. I genuinely do. But I have spent my whole life being the family's invisible infrastructure and I am done. I am done with it. I picked up my bag from under my chair. My mother said my name. I said, tell Curtis I love him. Tell Tamsin congratulations. I mean that. And then I walked out. The cold air outside was a shock after the warm candlelit restaurant. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. My mother. Then my father. Then a number I didn't recognize. Probably a relative who'd gotten a hold of my number at some point. I silenced it. I called my friend Priya, who I'd known since our sophomore year of college and who had, over many years and many late-night conversations, heard the broad outlines of most of this. Hey, she said when she picked up. I did it, I said. A pause. Did what? I walked out. The rehearsal dinner. I told my mom I wasn't going to be their housekeeper. Another pause. Then, oh my God. Are you okay? Where are you? Standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, I said. In my good heels. She laughed, not unkindly. Come over, she said. I have wine and leftovers from last night and you can tell me everything. I got in my car and drove to her apartment in Clintonville. I sat on her couch until midnight while she refilled my glass and asked the occasional question, and mostly just listened. By the time I drove home, something had loosened in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was tight. The next few weeks were difficult in the way that telling the truth is always difficult. My mother called every day for the first week. The calls followed a pattern. First, hurt. How could you do that at his rehearsal dinner? Then appeal to duty. Your brother needs you. Then something colder. You've always had a selfish streak, Vivienne, and I've never said anything but. I listened to all of them. I responded to some. My father sent a text. Not a call, a text that said, your mother is very upset. We expected better. I read it 3 times and then put my phone down and went for a walk around my neighborhood. Curtis called once, 4 days after the rehearsal dinner. He was not angry. He sounded more confused than anything. Viv, he said. I didn't know they'd been asking you to do that stuff. They haven't been hiding it, I said. I know, I didn't think about it. I should have thought about it. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I had ever heard from him, and I held on to it. I love you, I told him. I want you to be happy. I want your marriage to be good. But Tamsin is your partner, not mine. You two figure out the household. That's what being married is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yeah, okay. I went to the wedding. I want to be clear about that. I put on the bridesmaid dress, a deep burgundy, actually quite nice. And I stood at the front of the church and I watched my brother marry a woman who smiled at him like she meant it. And I cried a little, which I had not expected. At the reception, I danced with my cousins and ate an unreasonable amount of the salted caramel cake and stayed until 10 o'clock. I hugged Curtis and told him I was happy for him. I nodded at my parents and kept a careful, polite distance. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. I've come to prefer honest over warm when I can't have both. In January, I got a promotion. Senior account manager, a title I've been working toward for 2 years. A raise that meant, for the first time, I could comfortably build an emergency fund and still take an actual vacation. I booked a trip to Portugal in April, something I'd wanted to do since I was 22 and had been putting off for reasons I could no longer fully articulate. Dr. Park said, "Notice how much space opens up when you stop filling it with someone else's needs." I thought about that for a long time. In February, my mother and I had a conversation, not a fight, an actual conversation, on a Sunday afternoon at her kitchen table. I had driven over, which felt important. I had chosen to be there. I told her that I understood the world she'd grown up in, that I knew her own mother had taught her these things, had passed them down as survival tools, dressed up as values. That I didn't think she was a cruel person. But it was not okay, I said. What was asked of me? How I was raised. It wasn't fair to me, and I needed you to hear that. She didn't apologize. Not in so many words. But she was quiet for longer than usual. And then she said, "I worry about you, Vivienne. I always have." "I know," I said. "I'd like it if we could find a different way to show that. We're working on it. It's slow. It's imperfect. There are still phone calls that leave me tense and visits that require decompressing afterward. But there are also small things." She asked me about the Portugal trip, asked real questions, seemed genuinely interested. She called to tell me about a book she'd read that she thought I'd like. These are not huge things. But they are new. Curtis, for what it's worth, seems to be figuring out how to run a household. Tamsin told me at Easter dinner, yes, I went, we're finding our way back to some version of normal, that he'd been learning to cook on weekends. He made carnitas last Sunday, she said, from scratch. It took 4 hours and he was very proud of himself. Was it good? I asked. She grinned. It was incredible, actually. Don't tell him I told you. I thought about the boy who used to leave his wet towels on the bathroom floor and expect me to pick them up, who'd had breakfast waiting for him every morning for 18 years. Who had, somehow, grown into a man who could be taught. I drove home from Easter dinner with the windows down even though it was only 60 degrees, because the air felt good, and I'd earned the right to let it in. There's a Starbucks on the corner near the steakhouse in Worthington. I drive by it sometimes when I have a meeting near there, which happens a few times a year. Every time I pass it, I think about October. About standing on that sidewalk in my heels. About the feeling of cold air and relief. I don't slow down anymore when I pass it. I've stopped needing to mark the moment. That's how I know I'm actually okay. Not because the story has a perfect ending, or because everything in my family is resolved, or because I've stopped feeling the old pull toward shrinking myself to fit the space I was assigned, but because I can drive past that corner without it meaning something heavy. I can just drive. I had a call with Dr. Park last week. We've moved from weekly to every other week, which she says is a good sign. She asked what I wanted to focus on in the coming months. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that I was still getting used to having room to figure it out. She said that sounded exactly right. I think it does too. There's something nobody tells you about finally speaking up. The moment itself is never the hard part. The hard part is everything that comes after. The silence on the other end of the phone. The text from your father that says, "We expected better." The way a family dinner can feel like a negotiation for the rest of the year. I walked out of that rehearsal dinner in Worthington and I felt free for about 45 minutes. Then the call started and the freedom got complicated. But here's what I've come to understand, sitting with all of it now. The way things turned out was not an accident. It was cause and effect, plain and simple. My parents built a system. They assigned me a role before I was old enough to question it, and they maintained it by never naming it. Because unnamed things are harder to refuse. For 20 years I kept showing up. I kept doing the labor. I kept telling myself that one day it would change on its own, that someone would notice, that acknowledgement would come without me having to ask for it. It didn't come. It never does. When you're waiting for people who benefit from the arrangement to dismantle it themselves. The night my father toasted me, to Vivienne, who has always taken care of this family, I think he genuinely believed he was being kind. That's the part that took me longest to process. He wasn't being cruel. He was being oblivious, which is its own kind of harm. Slower and harder to name. Obliviousness, when it sits on top of real power, doesn't need cruelty to do damage. It just needs consistency. What I did, walking out, saying it plainly, refusing to let the moment pass with a gracious smile. That wasn't bravery in the cinematic sense. It was just exhaustion that had finally run out of patience. I had spent so long being the reasonable one, the accommodating one, the one who kept the peace, that I had mistaken compliance for virtue. I thought staying quiet was the moral high ground. I was wrong. Staying quiet was just staying quiet. It protected the system, not my dignity. Curtis making carnitas from scratch on a Sunday afternoon. That detail makes me laugh every time I think about it. Because that's what happens when you stop doing someone else's work for them. They figure it out. They rise to the expectation. That's not a small thing. That's cause and effect working exactly the way it's supposed to. He didn't become more capable because I pushed him. He became more capable because I stopped covering for his incapability. There's a version of help that stunts the person you're helping, and I had been providing that version for decades. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes some piece of their own life in mine is this: the discomfort of speaking the truth out loud. In the room where it matters, in front of the people it's meant for. That discomfort is finite. It has a beginning and an end. The discomfort of staying silent is not finite. It compounds. It becomes the shape of your life if you let it go on long enough. I'm still working things out with my mother. We're both trying. That's not a perfect ending, but it's an honest one. And honest is what I have now.